رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome you back to our course on Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja, or the Ship of Salvation, covering ibadat from a Shafi'i primer. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, we commence with this section on Tayammum, which follows from the previous section on wudu. And of course, just to remind ourselves, our course outcomes are to, number one, introduce our students to Islamic law. Number two, to have a first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school, and to learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level. So what we are looking at in this class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, is firstly the 3 causes of Tayammum, then the 10 conditions and 5 integrals of Tayammum, as well as the 3 nullifiers of Tayammum. And just a reminder, when we study fiqh, we generally look out for these subsections of every chapter. We will look for example, there will always be a definition, lughatan, istilahan, so literal and technical. Then you'll have a discussion on the shurut, which are the conditions, and then you'll have a detailed discussion on the integrals, which are the essential elements of a particular act of ibadah that would ensure that there's validity for that ibadah. And then depending on what the chapter in question really is, you may also have certain other elements, like here we have the 3 nullifiers of tayammum, or those things that would cause the tayammum to become invalid, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we commence from there. I've selected this ayah from Surah Al-Ma'idah, wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْدَ أَنْ أَقُولَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ وَإِن كُنْتُمْ مَرْضَى. This is not the beginning of the ayah. The section before this deals with wudu. But then continuing from this point, it says, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ مَرْضَى, if you are ill, أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ, or you are on a journey, أَوْ جَاءَ أَحَدٌ مِّنكُم مِّنَ الْغَائِطِ, or one of you comes back after having relieved themselves and answered the call of nature, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, or you touched the women, in other words, you touched a woman who is not your mahram, فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, and you do not have any water. So again, either you are ill or you are on a journey, so you have some extraneous circumstance that prohibits you from getting water, and you find a need to have wudu, or to have ablution, or to have some form of tahara, and you broke it. So فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, and you don't have any water, then فَتَيَمَّمُوا, then intend. So the word tayammum literally actually means to intend towards. فَتَيَمَّمُوا, so intend towards صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, pure earth, right? Pure earth. فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ, then wipe your faces, وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ, and your hands, minhu, of it, meaning of that pure earth. مَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ, مَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ, Allah does not want, لِيَجْعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ, to make things upon you, min harajin, difficult. Walakin, but, yuridu, he wants, liyutahhirakum, to purify you, waliyutimma ni'matahu alaykum, and to complete his favor upon you, la'allakum tashkurun, so that you may be grateful. This verse of the Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah serves as a springboard for our discussion. In this verse, we find the circumstances of tayammum, we find the word of tayammum being used, and of course it is from this word that this concept is derived as well. And then we find a context for it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, and let's just look at that in a basic overview format again. Firstly, the circumstance. If you are ill, on a journey, or have relieved yourselves, or have been intimate with your wives. Now the word lamastumun nisa, there's a bit of a technical discussion here, where in this form, lamastumun nisa would be a way of expressing not an ordinary touch, but rather a touch of intimacy with the women folk. So there's actually some form of intimacy that took place there. But in a different qira'ah, we read أو لمستم النساء. And it is from this that the Shafi'i school also derives evidence that touching one's wife or touching a غير mahram of the opposite gender would actually nullify one's wudu. But we've discussed that before in a previous dars. Then the verse carries on, فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, and you do not find any water. So we already have, if you are ill, you're on a journey, so for whatever reason, you don't have access to water, you cannot use water, and you broke your wudu, so you need to have some form of purification, then what you should do under those circumstances is to فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, intend towards pure earth, فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ, and then wipe your faces with it, وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ, as well as your hands, minhu, of that earth. And then the spiritual context, or the bigger picture that you'll only find in the Quran, you don't really deal with this type of element in fiqh, at least not at a basic level. مَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيَجْعَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْ حَرَجٍ. Allah doesn't want to make things difficult for you. Like, the practice of Islam is not intended to make your life inconvenient or difficult. So where you find extraneous circumstances, out of the ordinary circumstances, then you will find an alternative within the Sharia that would facilitate for you to still worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as you would normally do. So Allah doesn't want to make things difficult for you. وَلَكِنْ يُرِيدُ لِيُطَهِّرَكُمْ, but He wants to purify you. So Allah wants to facilitate a means for purification for you, both in terms of attaining purification for the ibadah as well as spiritual purification. وَلْيُتِمَّ نِعْمَتَهُ عَلَيْكُمْ, and so that He can complete His favor upon you. Any sort of lapse in your ibadah would mean that you do not enjoy the blessing of Allah Ta'ala entirely. So He wants to complete His favor upon you, His blessing upon you, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ, so that you may be grateful. So that sets the tone, inshallah ta'ala. Now we look at the text from Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja for the first segment of this lesson, which reads as follows: فَصْلٌ فِي أَسْبَابِ التَّيَمُّمِ, a chapter regarding the asbab, plural of the word sabab. Sabab means a cause, so asbab would mean the causes. At-tayammumi, of tayammum. So that's a mudaf mudafun ilayh construction. Asbabu tayammumi thalathatun. The causes of tayammum are three. There are three reasons for which a person may take tayammum. The first, faqdul ma'i, absence of water, wal maradu, illness, wal ihtiyaju ilayhi, and you may have water but you need the water for some other purpose, li'atashi hayawanin muhtaramin, in order to quench the thirst of a noble creature. And we'll of course explain all of these in detail. So this essentially highlights the three causes of tayammum. There are three reasons why you would resort to tayammum as opposed to wudu. The first is absence of water. We'll define that in greater detail as we proceed. The second is you may be suffering from an illness and therefore you are unable to utilize water. And the third is you have water, you can use the water, but you need the water for the reasons of quenching the thirst of a noble creature. And we'll explain that in a moment. So firstly, the author then defines what is a noble creature juxtaposed to what is not a noble creature. وَغَيْرُ الْمُحْتَرَمِ, I'm just doing the literal translation here before we explain everything. وَغَيْرُ الْمُحْتَرَمِ, and that which is not a noble creature, sittatun, are six. تَارِكُ الصَّلَاةِ, a human who abandons the prayer, a Muslim who abandons the prayer. So a person who abandons the prayer is not considered to be noble. Subhanallah, that's an interesting perspective. وَالزَّانِي الْمُحْصَنِ, and the person who is guilty of fornication, al-muhsan, who had experienced a halal nikah. When it comes to zina, it's always evil, it's always bad, it's always something that is very heinous within the framework of Islam. But there's a difference between the zani and the zani al-muhsan. So the zani unrestrictedly would be a person who commits zina who had never been in a halal marriage and has never consummated that halal marriage. So they've never tasted the permissible pleasures that Allah Ta'ala had ordained for them. That's one category of zina. But then you get the zani al-muhsan, which is a person who had experienced a halal marriage and they've consummated that marriage, and then thereafter, whether while they are married or afterwards, they engage in fornication. This would be a zani al-muhsan, right? And this is obviously looked at in a sense as a more grave sin than fornication. In English, we would generally translate the one as a fornicator, and the second one, azani al-muhsan, we would translate that as an adulterer. But be that as it may, the definition is more important. So what is an adulterer, or what is azani al-muhsan? It would be a person who was married or experienced a halal marriage and consummated that marriage, but then subsequently, either while they were married or after they were married, perhaps they were divorced or perhaps their spouse had passed away, they then indulge in fornication. That would make them an adulterer, and that would establish for them or make them worthy of the had, right? So the had in their case would be much more severe than the had of the other fornicator who was never married. And of course that would be rajam, stoning until they no longer exist. Wal-iyadhu billah, Allah protect us, save us and forgive us if we had ever committed these sins. And then the next one that is mentioned, wal-murtad, a person who apostatizes, right? An apostate from the deen of Islam. Wal-kafiru al-Harabiyyu, wal-kafiru, and a disbeliever, al-Harbi, who is from a warring country, meaning a country that is at war, or a people who is at war with the believers. That would make them not just a disbeliever, but a disbeliever who is a harbi, so they are from an enemy state or from an enemy nation. Another category or another element of ghayr al-muhtaram, a creature that is not considered noble, is wal-kalbu al-aqur wal-khinzir. So a dog and a pig, essentially. Now these are intended to define what is ghayr al-muhtaram, because our text said that you can have three reasons for needing tayammum. The one is you don't have water, the second one is you experience illness, and the third one is you have water but you need the water to quench the thirst of a person or an animal. The exception, of course, is that if you have a person or an animal that is not considered noble, is not considered honored in the Sharia, then their thirst would not be considered in respect to the causes of tayammum. So we'll elaborate a bit more about this, because it's a bit dark if you think about it, but it's not actually intended to be as dark as it seems. So let's proceed, inshallah ta'ala. Now, here we have the translation, and it will also allow me the opportunity to explain things in a bit, in further detail. We said the causes of tayammum are three. The first being the absence of water. This genuinely means that you don't have any water. You can see footnote number 40 says, if there is a little water that is insufficient for attaining purity, water should be used as much as possible, and then tayammum should be performed for the rest of the limbs. So this answers the question of what exactly does the absence of water entail. If you have, for example, a few milliliters of water, say 200 or 300 milliliters of water, and you find that it is not enough to perform a wudu, even just the obligatory elements of a wudu, then you don't have absence of water, you have some water. In that instance, you would use the water that you have to wash the obligatory limbs of wudu first, and when you run out of water, now you resort to tayammum, and tayammum is always the same, right? So many students become confused about tayammum, thinking that in cases where you have some water, or in cases where you cannot wash a particular limb, that you would perform tayammum in a special way by rubbing dirt or by rubbing earth on that particular limb. That's not the case. Tayammum is always the same. So that covers the first reason why you would need to resort to tayammum. Whether this be an absence of water under normal circumstances, like you are in the middle of a desert, so therefore you don't have any access to water, or unusual circumstances whereby you don't have water for that moment. Perhaps there's some temporary reason why there's no availability of water. In either case, you have the first cause of tayammum covered there. Number 2 is illness, right? So what we are referring to here is not like a flu or cold. Under normal circumstances, you can still use water if you are ill from a flu or from a cold. What this is referring to is the type of illness that would cause you harm, right, if you were to resort to using water, whether that be because of some physical injury or because of the effect of water on your body. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala alam. But it's an illness that would prolong the illness, it would cause you further damage or further illness, it would make your illness worse, right, or it would prolong recovery. Under these circumstances, you may resort to tayammum. So footnote number 41 says, an ailment that a person fears would cause harm to life or limb, disability, becoming seriously ill, an increase in one's ailment, a delay in recovering from one's illness, or considerable pain, or a bad effect from the water, such as a radical change in one's skin color or visible part of the body. Those are the types of illnesses that would permit one to resort to tayammum as opposed to wudu. Now, when it comes to the causes of tayammum and illness in particular, this is something that generally you would either know because it's obvious, or you would need the advice of a physician, a qualified physician. And when it comes to taking the advice of a qualified physician, my go-to principle is acquire the advice of a God-fearing Muslim physician. This would be the best. Why do you need a God-fearing Muslim physician? Because if you're going to take an atheist, for example, or non-Muslim, they may not understand the seriousness, or they may not consider the seriousness of Islam, the seriousness of ibadah, the seriousness of salah and the like. And for that reason, their opinion may not take that as very weighty. Whereas a God-fearing Muslim physician would take that into consideration. However, if you don't have access to a God-fearing Muslim physician and you have to resort to either a Muslim who is not really God-fearing, and of course that shouldn't be the case, but if that is the case and you don't have access to a Muslim physician in the first place, then I would advise that you take the opinion of at least 2 qualified physicians and express to them the seriousness of wudu and the seriousness of salah and the seriousness of ibadah in Islam before you take their view. But if they do express that, look, despite the seriousness of these acts of worship, still you should not use water because of these medical considerations, then fabiha wa na'imat. The verse in the Quran is clear that if you are ill, you may resort to tayammum. And then number 3, we said the need for water exists by oneself or worthy animals. Now, I believe this list, even though completely legitimate as far as Islamic law is concerned, there's 2 very important considerations that we must remember here. Number 1, tayammum is not a usual circumstance thing. There are very few, if any, circumstances in the modern world where you can legitimately perform tayammum because of the absence of water, right, without needing to repeat the prayer. I'm sort of not saying a lot there. It's a more advanced discussion, but the point that you really need to take from this is that tayammum is not a usual circumstance or everyday phenomenon. Secondly, the chances of you needing to perform tayammum because of not having water and then having some water that you need to utilize for another person or another creature, and then not taking them into consideration because of this classification as being unworthy, the chances of that are even more of an anomalous situation. So these are not things that you're actually going to practically apply. What we learn from it, though, is the status of these individuals and how serious these crimes are, or how serious these situations are for a Muslim. Apostasy, adultery, a person who forsakes their salah, a person who is from a non-Muslim who is from a country that is at war with the Muslims. These are serious considerations. So under those circumstances, yes, the fiqh would apply. However, remember the context of the sunnah always, right? Sometimes if you learn fiqh without ever thinking about the practical application thereof within the life of the Prophet ﷺ, you fall into a situation whereby you are strictly following the letter of the law but completely ignoring the spirit of the law. In the sunnah we learn that a person could achieve Jannah, could attain Jannah despite having a background of being a prostitute, simply because you are willing to give a dog a sip of water to drink, right? So under those considerations, you would understand that a Muslim in a practical sense, if they find themselves in a situation where there's somebody dying of thirst and they need to quench the person's thirst, for that Muslim to then say, look here, I'm not going to quench your thirst because I'm going to use this water for my wudu, because my fiqh said that you are not a worthy individual. If a Muslim decides at that point to say, look, I'm going to quench your thirst because I need to save your life, because the Quran also says that whosoever takes a life, it's as though they took the lives of all of mankind, and whosoever saves a life, it is as though they saved the lives of all of mankind. That must be considered as well, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Tamam. So I just thought that it's good to shine light on that, because if you take things too literally, then you may fall into these type of confusions, and Allah knows best. So of course we said a vicious dog and a pig as well, because of the status of those animals as being najasa in light of the Shafi'i school. And we continue from there. What you need to take away from this, the most important is that there are 3 reasons why you may need to take tayammum, why you may need to resort to tayammum. The one is there's absence of water. The second is you have an illness that makes it difficult for you or impossible for you to use water. And then number 3, that there's a need for the water by yourself or by another. And then of course we have this caveat of a worthy creature. So from that point, of course, as we usually do, I provide you with the sharh from Nailur Raja, a sharh of Safinat Al-Naja. We don't go through that in the class, but it is for the sake of the students who are registered for this course, and for your reference when you prepare as well as when you revise the work, bi'idhnillah. We move on to the next segment, which deals with Shurut al-Tayammum. Faslun fi Shurut al-Tayammumi, a chapter regarding the conditions of the Tayammum. Shurut al-Tayammumi asharatun. The conditions of Tayammum are 10. Number 1, ay yakuna bi turabin. Tayammum must be with turab, with sand, with earth, with dust. We'll explain the details of this in the translation. وَأَن يَكُونَ التُّرَابُ طَاهِرًا. The earth or the dust must be pure. وَأَن لَا يَكُونَ مُسْتَعْمَلًا. It must not be used. وَأَن لَا يُخَالِطَهُ. And it must not be mixed or should not be mixed with it. دَقِيقٌ. Flour. وَنَحْوُهُ. And similar substances. So it shouldn't be a mixture of items. وَأَن يَقْصِدَهُ. The person performing tayammum must actually intend towards it. Right? They must actually intend towards it. They must deliberately intend towards it. We'll explain that as well. وَأَن يَمْسَحَ وَجْهَهُ. And he should wipe his face. وَيَدَيْهِ. And his hands. بِضَرْبَتَيْنِ. With 2 strikes. With 2 strikes. We'll demonstrate this as well. وَأَن يُزِيلَ النَّجَاسَةَ. And they must remove filth. أولا. Before performing the tayammum. وَأَن يَجْتَهِدَ فِي الْقِبْلَةِ قَبْلَهُ. And they should seek to establish the direction of the qibla before going into tayammum. وَأَن يَكُونَ التَّيَمُّمُ. And the tayammum must be بَعْدَ دُخُولِ الْوَقْتِ. After the entrance of the salah's time. وَأَن يَتَيَمَّمَ لِكُلِّ فَرْضٍ. And they should perform tayammum for each fard prayer, for each obligatory prayer. Now, as I said, we're going to do this essentially 3 times. The one is going to be the literal translation, which is what we just did. Then we go on to the explanation and translation again. And this is just as a means of teaching with, revision in mind. So this section deals with the conditions of tayammum. We said in every section of fiqh, you're going to have a definition, you're going to have the shurut, and you're going to have the arkan. Here are our shurut. These are the conditions of tayammum. The first one says that it must be performed with the dust of the earth. So essentially this means it must be with sand. And the type of sand that you need to use is dust producing sand. It must be natural. Yes, it must come from the earth. It mustn't be a manufactured form of sand like lime or powder or something of the sort. But it must be earth, natural earth, and it must be dust producing. So when you strike it or when you blow onto that earth, you would find that it would turn into some sort of a cloud of dust. This is further defined by the other conditions. One important point here that's not explicitly mentioned in the text is that the dust or the earth, because it must be producing dust, it cannot be wet. So you cannot perform tayammum with wet sand or with moist earth, right? Because there would be no dust in such earth. The second point is that the dust must be pure. How do you have pure dust? You have pure dust based on the fact that there's no najasa in the dust. Now, immediately here, it's important for me to state that you can only establish najasa in dust if you've actually witnessed najasa entering that dust, entering the earth. So the idea of, there's a possibility that an animal was here and that the animal relieved themselves in this earth, that is not considered in the Sharia. We don't work on possibilities, we work on probabilities, we work on evidence. So if you've seen, or there's certain signs that definitively makes it such that, a dog was here or an animal was here and relieved themselves here, then you would, if you don't have that type of evidence, you would consider it to be pure. If you have that type of evidence, then of course you would know that it is contaminated, so it is impure. Still, we can see that it's very general. We are only sort of eliminating, the types of earth that you cannot use. So any type of natural sand, any type of natural earth that gives any form of dust, even if it's slight, it doesn't have to be dusty in the sense of, there's huge clouds of dust that comes from that. Whether this is beach sand, whether this is garden sand, these are all perfectly fine. Number 3, the dust must not be used, meaning that it must not be dust that was already utilized for the purpose of tayammum. How do you get that? This doesn't mean that you have a pile of sand or a pile of earth and then you perform tayammum with that you can no longer perform tayammum with that again in the future. Because if you think about it logically, you only make contact with a very small percentage of the sand in front of you. This is in reference to the dust that comes off your limbs. So if you had dust on your face and on your arms because of tayammum, and you somehow manage to collect that dust and save it somewhere else, you cannot reuse that dust specifically for tayammum again. Number 4, we said it mustn't be mixed with flour or similar substances. Now, this may be because I can imagine some people would have thought, look, we can take earth that has absolutely no dust. So, for example, garden soil, that's like a black type of earth. And in order to make it, have a dusty effect, we'll add some flour therein, right? This wouldn't work. And any other type of similar substance would also, disqualify that earth. So this is flour. They also mention lime, and I can add to that powder or some other form of cosmetic powder. So it mustn't be mixed with flour or anything like flour. Number 5, a person should intend the earth. It's a bit of a confusing way to say this, but if you go outside and it's a windy day and there's dust blowing in the wind, there's sand blowing in the wind, and you just stand there and you think, well, okay, I might as well perform tayammum now, and then you wipe your arms and your face and your arms, and then you say, well, that should be sufficient for tayammum. It would not be, because you did not intend the earth. فَتَيَمَّمُوا, right? So you must intend towards صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, pure earth. Another example of this may be that you were maybe working in the garden, or you were digging something, and then you have all this dust on your face and on your hands, and then you think, okay, I might as well just utilize this for tayammum. You cannot do that. You must actually go towards the sand, go towards the earth, in order for it to be valid. Number 6, he should wipe his face and both hands with 2 strikes of dust. Meaning, you would strike the earth once and wipe the face, and then you would strike the earth the second time and you would wipe both hands. So there's only 2 strikes. And this is going to be universally applied, right? This is now the 3rd time that I'm mentioning this, so, without sort of clarifying it. So I'll clarify it now. There's certain circumstances where you are performing tayammum because you cannot wash one limb. A good example of this would be in the Shafi'i school. If you have a bandage on a limb of wudu, let's say it's your right foot, okay? So you have a cast on your right foot, you cannot remove the cast. So now you need to perform wudu. Now the Shafi school is very strict on this issue, and there's lots of details to it, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. The point here is, how does tayammum come into play? So for the Shafi'i, what they need to do is perform a usual wudu. So they wash their hands, their mouth, their nose, their face, their arms, their hair, their head, and the ears, and then the feet. But when they get to the feet, they cannot wash the foot. So when they get there, now the Shafi'i school requires of them to perform a complete tayammum for that limb at that point. It's at this point that students become confused, and they think that, okay, so tayammum in this instance means that you would take dust on your hands and wipe it over that cast. That is false. That is completely incorrect. You never wipe anything besides your face and your arms for tayammum. And that's exactly what I meant when I said tayammum is always the same. So even though you're taking tayammum because you cannot wash your right foot, still you would resort to washing all the other limbs in a usual way and performing a tayammum by wiping your face and your arms with earth at the point where you would have washed your right foot. So I hope that clarifies it, inshallah ta'ala. Number 7, he should first remove any impurity. Before you go into the process of tayammum, if there's any najasa on your person or on your clothing, it's necessary to first remove that and then perform the tayammum. Number 8, he should determine the direction of the qibla before commencing the tayammum. Now this point here, you will see in the footnotes provided to you, the opinion given here is, the preferred view is that tayammum will be correct if it has been performed after the entering of the time of salah, even before a person determines the direction of the qibla. The reason why it says that is there's ikhtilaf, there's a difference of opinion between Ibn Hajar al-Haytami and Imam al-Ramli in this instance. So Ibn Hajar says that you must determine the direction of the qibla before engaging in tayammum. So let's say you're in the middle of the desert, you don't have any water, you're going to perform tayammum. According to Ibn Hajar, you must first determine which direction the qibla is in and then perform tayammum, because you must immediately perform the salah thereafter. However, Imam al-Ramli says this is not a condition. You can first do your tayammum and then determine the direction of the qibla and proceed as per normal. So there's some ikhtilaf. Whichever view you follow, it would be valid, because that's a difference at the level of Ibn Hajar and Imam al-Ramli. And the author of this translation is giving us the preferred view of Imam al-Ramli. So that is to clarify the point number 8. Point number 9, you should make tayammum after the entering of the time of salah. So when it comes to wudu, you can perform wudu at any time, right? And you can still have the wudu when the next waqt comes in, as long as you didn't break it, nullify it. When it comes to tayammum, however, it's important to first wait for the time of that particular salah to enter and then engage in the act of tayammum. And there are several reasons for this, but as a shart, it's sufficient to say that you must wait for the entrance of the time of the salah before you perform a tayammum. Now the next point sort of goes hand in hand with number 9, and that is the person should make tayammum for every fard salah, meaning that you cannot keep one tayammum till the next waqt, right? You have to renew the tayammum for every fard salah, though you can perform as many sunnah salahs with one single tayammum as you so desire. That's what it says in footnote number 47. Several sunnah salahs can be performed with the fard salah either before or after the fard salah. Tamam. And then as we usually do, we have the sharh from Nailur Raja, and that's for our students to revise with and to check a more detailed explanation. If there's anything that you wish to go over it again, you may do so there. So that covers the first discussion. The second discussion we are now at the third discussion, which is about the integrals of tayammum. Once again, in fiqh, we study definitions first, then conditions, then integrals, and then other factors. So we've covered definition, we've covered the conditions, and now we are discussing the integrals. These are the elements that make up the act of ibadah. Without them, there's no act of ibadah. With them, the act of ibadah is complete. Now, when we discuss integrals, it's also important to understand that integrals will not mention the sunan, right? So the optimal way of doing something would include all of the sunnahs. When you learn the integrals, it's to just get the basic foundation in place so that you have a valid act of worship. So let's look at that بإذن الله تعالى. في فرائض التيمم, the obligatory elements of tayammum. فروض التيمم خمسة, the obligatory elements of tayammum are 5. الأول نقل التراب, الثاني النية, الثالث مسح الوجه, الرابع مسح اليدين إلى المرفقين, الخامس الترتيب بين المسحتين. Let's just look at the translation of the words and we'll explain it with the translation inshallah. فروض التيمم خمسة. Furud is the plural of fard. It's also fara'id, as you can see here in the heading. So the obligatory elements at-tayammumi of tayammum khamsatun are 5. Al-awwalu, the first, naqlu turab, the transferring or transfer of the sand or the earth. Al-thani, an-niyya. As you know, in the Shafi school, the niyya is going to be part of every act of ibadah. الثالث مسح الوجه, the wiping of the face. الرابع مسح اليدين, wiping of the hands. إلى المرفقين, إلى to المرفقين, the 2 elbows, meaning up to and including the 2 elbows. الخامس, the 5th, الترتيب بين المسحتين, there needs to be sequence followed between the 2 wipes. So the one wipe is for the face, and then immediately thereafter another wipe for the arms. So these are your literal translation, and let's explain them inshallah. The integrals of tayammum are 5. The first, the transfer of earth to the body. There must be a transfer. As we said in the conditions as well, you cannot just happen to have some earth on you, some dust on you, and then use that as a basis for your tayammum. I've got some sand on me, let me just wipe my limbs and then I have a tayammum. It won't work, right? You need to actually transfer the earth from where the earth is situated, from where the sand is situated, and then go down, strike it, and then move that towards the limbs of the body. The second point here is the niyyah, the intention. Now it's important, it's a bit of a technicality, but in the Shafi'i school, you cannot have the intention as you would for wudu. You can't say to yourself or have this consciousness of purpose that I'm performing a wudu via tayammum, because that's not exactly what's taking place. You cannot intend the removal of the state of impurity, because you're not removing the state of impurity. What you are doing is you are performing tayammum in order to make the salah permissible. So to make the salah permissible, I'm performing tayammum. What's my intention? The permissibility of salah. That would suffice as an intention when it comes to tayammum. Then wiping of the face. Now, of course, the wiping of the face for tayammum is going to be somewhat different to the wiping of the face for wudu, because you're using earth, sand, dust, and not water. With water, you can be thorough and you can make sure that the water reaches all the areas of your skin, underneath the hair, between the hairs, every portion of the skin on the face. But the same doesn't apply to the tayammum. So footnote number 50 says, it is not necessary to make the earth reach the skin under the hair of the face and arms. It is, however, necessary to pass the hands over that part of the beard which is visible. And that's all that you need to do. So you strike the earth once, and then you transfer that earth to the face, and you wipe the entire face. Just one wipe, and it doesn't need to be thorough. You don't need to, use the earth and then give yourself a face scrub, as they call it these days. So the wiping of the face is just a simple passing of the hands over the face with the dust that you have on your hands. Then number 4 says wiping of the 2 hands including the elbows. So it says ilal mirfaqain, up to and including the 2 elbows. Now that is the official position of the Shafi'i school. However, according to the Qadim view of Imam Shafi'i, I'm not sure if I explained the Qadim and the Jadid view, but briefly, Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala had different phases in his teaching of fiqh. What he taught in his Iraqi phase, when he was the teacher of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and others, rahimahumullah ta'ala, we call that the Qadim view, because he revised his fiqh thereafter. In the year 200, he then proceeded towards Misr, Egypt. He established himself there. He had a revision of his fiqh. He had new students, and he changed some of his views based on new thinking, new evidence, a new rationale, a new approach that he learned along the way. We refer to these opinions, his final opinions, as his Jadid view in the Shafi'i school. Now, when it comes to fatwa, right, giving the ruling of the Shafi'i madhab, the ruling of the Shafi'i school is going to always be based on the Jadid view, because that's his latest views. There's only about 15 cases in which we go according to the Qadim view, meaning his previous opinions. There's a lot that we can discuss about the Qadim and the Jadid, but at this level, that's sufficient. Now, according to the Qadim view, Imam Shafi'i said you only need to wipe according to the, or rather up to and including the wrists, qaw'ain. That is the view of other madhahib, like the Hanbali school, and it's also the view of Imam Shafi'i in the Qadim school. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he prefers this view over the mu'tamad view of the madhab. So even though Imam Nawawi is the sort of the spokesman of the Shafi'i school, when he gives fatwa according to the Shafi'i school, he would say this is the Shafi'i madhab's view, and that is to wipe up to and including the elbows. But sometimes his own preference, his own legal understanding would be different to that of the Shafi'i school, and he would make that known without confusing it with the madhab itself. So we find this phenomenon in the school, and therefore we can say that Imam Nawawi's ikhtiyar, his preferred view, is that of the Qadim of Imam Shafi'i, which is to wipe only up until the wrists and not to the elbows, and Allah knows best. So that was number 4, wiping of the 2 hands including the elbows, which is the mu'tamad, the relied upon view in the Shafi'i school. And then number 5, the tartib between the 2 wipings. So instead of considering tartib as immediate succession, tartib means sequence. Sequence in wudu is easy, sequence in tayammum is even easier. First the face, then the arms. So one strike, you basically take your hands, separate your fingers slightly, which we'll mention later, and strike the earth. Then knock off the excess dirt and wipe the face once. That's the first part of the tayammum. The second strike is exactly the same, and then you wipe the arms, which we'll also demonstrate a little later, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And following that sequence, that is considered an integral of tayammum, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Tamam. Now we proceed. Again, I'll show you that we have the sharh over here from Nailul Raja. And then we have the final section, which is about the mubtilat, the nullifiers of tayammum, those factors that would break or nullify one's tayammum. Faslun fi mubtilat tayammumi, a chapter regarding the nullifiers of tayammum. Mubtilat tayammumi thalathatun, the nullifiers of tayammum are three. Ma abtala al-wudu'a, that which would nullify the wudu would also nullify the tayammum. War-riddatu, and apostasy. We'll explain each one again as we do in the translation. وَتَوَهُّمُ الْمَاءِ إِن تَيَمَّمَ لِفَقْدِهِ, as well as having the impression of water, meaning you think that there's water available. In tayammama, if the reason for you performing tayammum was لِفَقْدِهِ, because of the absence of water. Now, in explaining this, what we are looking at here is what breaks your tayammum, right? What nullifies it. The first is that which nullifies the wudu. Now, by now, insha'Allah ta'ala, a diligent student would know exactly what breaks the wudu according to the Shafi'i school. There are 4 factors which nullify the wudu. I'm not going to repeat them here, but this is a good point in which to test your own knowledge. Do I know exactly what breaks the wudu according to my school of fiqh? So that's the first thing that would break one's tayammum. The second thing is apostasy, which is an interesting element here because, again, it's more theoretical than practical. When somebody apostatizes, we're not going to be asking if they had a tayammum and so forth and whether the tayammum broke. That's obviously going to be, in a practical sense, a bit absurd, under those circumstances. But there is a theoretical application here that is worthy of note. Ridda or apostasy is not considered to break the wudu, but it is considered to break the tayammum. Why is that? Wudu is an actual process of purification, like you're actually cleaning the limbs. When the person, wal-iyadhu billah, leaves the fold of Islam, that act is a spiritual move away from Islam, and it would not impact the physical purity. So physically, the wudu isn't automatically nullified. And I can think of one situation that may, sort of be considered, and that is if the person apostatizes and immediately makes tawbah and comes back into the fold of Islam and they had wudu, they'll still have wudu. But for tayammum, it would break one's tayammum if you apostatize, again, wal-iyadhu billah, because it's not a physical act of purification. When you perform tayammum, you are not actually purifying your limbs. If anything, you actually, sort of in a daily life sense, you're making your limbs a little dirtier because you're taking earth, you're taking sand, and you're wiping it over your limbs. So from a physical perspective, that's not purification. It's a spiritual act that is symbolized by a physical action. So for that reason, it's considered a tahara da'ifa. It's considered like a weak form of purification because it's hukman. It's a legal construct as opposed to being a physical reality. So apostasy breaks the tayammum. And then number 3, if the reason for you having performed a tayammum is that you don't have any water. So a practical example here would be you're at home and suddenly the water in your home, the water in your area all gets shut off for some reason. There's a burst pipe somewhere and you have no access to water. You didn't know that this was coming, so you don't have any spare, you don't have any backup, and it's time for you to pray. Under such a circumstance, you then proceed, you look for water, you do everything you need to do, you don't come right, and you go and you perform tayammum. Now you start your prayer, and suddenly you hear a sound that makes you think that it could be the water that was turned on because it sounds like water flowing through the pipes of your home. That mere suspicion that, the water is back would be sufficient to establish, or rather it would be sufficient to nullify your tayammum immediately. Whether the water is actually there or not is a different discussion. We are speaking about tawahhumul ma, the mere impression that there's water available. If the reason for you performing tayammum was that you didn't have water, then the mere impression or the mere suspicion that there is water would break your tayammum immediately, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Here the example is given. This will apply even if one sees a mirage thinking it to be water, or you see people who may have water, some travelers who came through. But it will not break if something prevents usage of the water for wudu. For example, one-sided water, but it is only sufficient for drinking, or an enemy prevents one from acquiring it. So those are the circumstances. Now you understand what exactly would break the tayammum as well. Again, what nullifies the wudu? Apostasy and having the impression that there's availability of water, if that was the reason for you having performed tayammum. Once again, you have the sharh from Nailur Raja. That's not for us going through here, that's for you, so that you can read through the notes again and do revision accordingly. And then the final note here is on the sunnah way to perform tayammum, which would also give us the opportunity to sort of do a demonstration of this. So from the top, we begin everything in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كل أمر ذي بال لم يبدأ به ببسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فهو أجذم أو أقطع. The Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said that any matter of importance that is not commenced with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be severed from its blessings. So we commence everything with the basmala. Then wipe the upper face before the lower face. Now, here we go into the tayammum. So you take your hands, separate your fingers slightly, which is also sunnah, strike the earth once, and then wipe the face. Now, any wiping of the face would count as wiping the face as long as you are somewhat thorough. But the sunnah would be to go from the top part of the face and wipe towards the bottom part of the face. Then you strike the earth again. Second strike. After each strike, by the way, as I mentioned earlier on, you should do that. You just dust off the hands, because the idea is not to have a dusty face. That's not the point. So any excess dirt, even if you look at your hands and it doesn't look like there's anything on your hands, that's fine, right? So you got rid of the excess dirt. Then you wipe the right arm before the left arm. So there's a bit of a methodology that's mentioned here. And if you only read it, even if you read it a few times, it may confuse you. But if you see it even once, would suffice. So what it says here is that you would take your hands like this. I don't know how this is going to look on camera, because the right and the left sometimes looks a bit confusing. But you would have your right hand on top of your left hand with the fingers crossing each other. Then you would lower your left hand behind the right hand until you reach your wrist. At this point, you would curl your fingers around your arm and then pull your hand all the way till the elbow, right? Going past the elbow itself. Then you curl your hand around. So now my left hand is on top of my forearm. And you then push forward until you reach the wrist again, at which point you turn your hand so that you're going to grip your thumb, and you end off like that by just pulling your hand over the thumb. You repeat the same process for the left hand side with the same dust. Pull your hand down, curl it around all the way till the elbow, turn the hand to the front side of the arm, push forward, and then end off with the thumb. And that covers the entire arm space in a manner that is sufficient for the purposes of tayammum. Again, you do not need to be thorough, and of course your arms need to be without clothes on it. If you follow the view of Imam Nawawi, or the view of the other schools of thought that says you only need to wipe your hands till the wrist as opposed to the elbows, then it would be even simpler, in which case you would just wipe over the right hand like that and over the left hand like that, in any way that covers the two hands really. That would suffice, and Allah knows best. One separates the fingers when striking the earth each of the 2 times, and one must remove one's ring for the second wipe, or for the second before wiping the arms. So if you have a watch or you have a ring on your finger, then you would necessarily have to take this off for the tayammum to be valid. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Now the tayammum is something that I think I performed it once in my life, and if I recall correctly, it was while we were on the road, and the waqt of a salah was leaving us, and we were a bit lost. So we needed to perform the salah. We couldn't get any access to water. So we stopped along the side of the road, looked around for water, couldn't find any water, so we needed to perform tayammum. And then we repeated the salah later. Still, at this point, I think it's important that you try to think about situations wherein you may need tayammum, and then visualize yourself in the situation. What would you do? Where would you go and find earth with the conditions that we mentioned, and how would you go about performing this tayammum for the sake of completing your salah? The last point that I wish to mention before dealing with the lesson summary is that even if you don't have the earth, even if you don't have some sand or some dusty, earthy substance from the earth that's natural that you can use, you still need to perform your salah. So under those circumstances, you are considered to be faqidut tahurain, a person who has neither form of purification. So you don't have water, you don't have sand, still you must complete that act of worship. So you do so without any form of tahara whatsoever, but you would of course need to repeat the salah later on when you do have access to them, and Allah knows best. Tamam. So what did we cover in this lesson, and what is it that you need to know and walk away with? Firstly, you need to know the 3 causes of tayammum. Right? Why would you need to resort to tayammum? Secondly, you need to know that there are 10 conditions of tayammum, the shurut. What are they? And you need to know the 5 integrals of tayammum. What do you need in order for the tayammum to be valid? And then finally, the 3 nullifiers of tayammum. What would break your tayammum? I'll leave you with a question, inshallah ta'ala, and then I have some questions that came through on the Zoom platform, which I'll tend to. And that question is, how many obligatory prayers can be prayed with one tayammum? By this point in the dars, you should be able to answer that question. And then, of course, I hope and pray that you are also taking the quiz that comes with every lesson. If you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook or any of the other platforms, then you won't have access to that. But if you are registered, which you can do at seekersguidance.org, if you are registered for the course, you have access to the course landing page via a platform called Moodle, and you can then not only revise the lessons in video format, but you also receive the slides in the form of course notes and access to a quiz, multiple choice quiz, quite straightforward, but it gives you the opportunity to make sure that you understood the dars, that you've taken the necessary information with you, and that you are able to apply it within the context of a practical situation. You'll get an assessment based on that, and you can comfortably move over to the next lesson knowing that you've covered everything sufficiently. So do register if you haven't already done so. Until next time, inshallah, jazakumullahu khairan, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.